Hi everyone, it's 314 React here. We have a bit of a surprise this week as 3DMark have released a brand new benchmark for the new 3DMark application, which I just started looking at last week as a part of my 3DMark series that I've been going through. So it's quite a coincidence that this is released. So today I was meant to be looking at Time Spy, Night Raid, and the CPU profile. But we are switching it up to look at Steel Nomad, which is available for free on Steam. You can just download 3DMark and then download Steel Nomad within that as DLC. And then you will see it under here, right next to Speedway. You'll see Steel Nomad and Steel Nomad Lite. This one's for high-end gaming PCs and this one's for lightweight PCs, and this one is also on Android as well. And what this also features is a interactive run called Explorer Mode, which looks really cool from what I've seen so far. So the first thing we're going to do is dive into the technical aspects of this using the technical guide on the ul.com website. Then we're going to run the demos again, and we're going to have a look at the performance, and then we're going to look at the Explorer mode. So as mentioned, I've been going through all of the 3DMark benchmarks over the past few weeks, and now we have reached the latest one, which is really cool. So if you want to see more content like this, do make sure to like and subscribe. There's always new videos coming up on tech projects and graphics and video games, so stick around for that, and let's dive into looking into the technical aspects of Steel Nomad. So Steel Nomad is a DirectX 12 benchmark for high-end gaming PCs, and it's been developed with input from AMD, Intel, and Nvidia, as well as other members of the UL benchmark development program, which I wouldn't mind being a part of, to be honest. It's available on Windows and Windows on ARM, and it's designed to test gaming PCs that support DirectX 12 or Vulkan 1.1, and the main workload is a graphics test measuring GPU performance. It also has HDR available if you have a HDR monitor. We've got more detailed requirements here. Windows 11 or Windows 10 64-bit, a 1.8 GHz dual-core CPU with SSS E3 support, 8 GB of RAM, and a graphics card with DirectX 12, feature level 12 or Vulkan 1.1 capabilities, and 6 GB of VRAM, as well as 1.4 GB of free space. And of course, what we're looking at here is the official documentation from the UL website. I'll put the link in the description to this. It's similar to the technical guides that I've seen, the PDFs and white papers, but it's actually on their website, as well as all of the details of all their other stuff. So this is a good reference point. Let's have a look at the graphics test itself. So Steel Nomad is a graphics benchmark. The test measures GPU performance using a non-ray traced game-like workload, and it does not have a CPU test. The main rendering resolution is 3840 by 2160, which is 4K essentially, or UHD I think more precisely, and it does not support multi-GPU configurations. The main role of the CPU is to compose the command lists that the GPU executes. The Steel Nomad engine is multi-threaded and divides the work between all logical cores. If the CPU cannot submit work to the GPU fast enough, it will be the limiting factor in the benchmark, effectively invalidating the result of the graphics test. Steel Nomad requires a multi-core CPU to run at high frame rates. The exact point at which the benchmark becomes bound by the CPU depends on the configuration of the system. There's some information here about how the score is calculated, and here we get to the really interesting bit, the engine itself. So as mentioned, it does not have a CPU test. The CPU does obviously factor into how fast it will run, as mentioned earlier. The rendering, including scene update, visibility, evaluation, and command list building, is done with multiple CPU threads using one thread per available logical CPU core, shortens the CPU rendering time, and reduces the chance of CPU becoming a bottleneck. So it's heavily multi-threaded to get as much information on what needs to be rendered to the GPU as possible, as fast as possible. So here we go into the multi-subpass rendering. When available, multi-subpass rendering or an equivalent API technology is used for the G-buffer, decals, illumination, and transparency rendering steps. This is used by Steel Nomad when using the Vulkan, Metal, and DirectX 12 graphics APIs and is supported by the GPU. So of course, a pass and rendering is where you've got a number of operations that have gone through and rendered to a frame, whereas I believe subpasses are where you can go over bits of data in a frame. It means you don't have to actually resolve and store results from the previous pass in, so you can do that within a single rendering pass. So it can be very much more faster from what I've read, and a lot more efficient, and you get a lot more operations done within a single pass. You've got geometry rendering here. Opaque objects are rendered using a deferred rendering method in the graphics pipeline, using the temporary G-buffer targets for physically based rendering material parameters. In addition to the final lighting result, some data from the G-buffer is saved and used for future shading passes. Transparent objects are rendered in an order-independent way using two passes. The first pass uses temporary targets to store accumulated color contribution and transparency weighted based on linear depth and total transparency. The second pass calculates the final color from the accumulated color and transparency. The result of the transparent object's pass is blended on top of the final surface illumination. So essentially, yeah, you're getting the ability to do transparency and do effects with it without having to use ray tracing, because obviously this is rasterized, doing 2 passes. So I'm guessing you probably implement some sort of reflection and refraction within that using that 2-pass system. Decals are rendered right after G-buffer rendering. Decals modify the G-buffer and add further details to geometry surfaces. Surface illumination, specular reflections, and diffuse global illumination use data sampled from multiple probes distributed around the benchmark scene. So yeah, it's using probes to gather light data from around the scene rather than using ray tracing. There are particles simulated on the GPU using compute shaders, which makes sense as it's the sort of pipeline we've been seeing for a number of years now, using compute shaders to calculate particles. The particles are rendered at the same time with transparent geometry using the same order independent technique. Particles are illuminated by directional light. So it doesn't mention that the particles can illuminate each other, and they're just illuminated from a single directional light, not point lights. So not quite as advanced as it could be, but it's still pretty cool to see, again, compute shaders being used for particle rendering. Grass rendering. Blades of grass are distributed with their level of detail, size, and density based on distance from camera. This is done in compute shaders and then rendered to the G-buffer. So again, more compute shaders being used and then rendered to the G-buffer when they're done. Really, really cool. Slight spelling mistake there. Done in computer shaders. It's just compute shaders, but that's forgivable. Asynchronous compute. In Steel Nomad, asynchronous compute is used to overlap the first volume illumination pass with other rendering passes. Steel Nomad Light does not use asynchronous compute. So essentially what's happening there is while they're doing the volume illumination, it's using other resources on the GPU to do other rendering passes. Guessing because the other rendering passes don't rely on the output of volume illumination, which makes sense. So you're getting more efficient use of the GPU hardware there. Volumetric clouds. The sky is drawn in a compute shader using Raymarch volumetric cloud rendering. The sky is dynamic with clouds moving throughout the timeline. Screen space shadows, and that's very basic screen space shadows just being used to calculate contact shadows, so in the grass and stuff like that, which is a lot more efficient than doing individual shadow maps for individual blades of grass and stuff like that. Screen space reflections. Screen space reflections used to calculate reflections of pixels rendered on screen. A cube map fallback is used for reflections of surfaces outside of screen space. Fairly standard stuff for rasterization. Essentially, you're just using, as it says there, pixels rendered on the screen to form a reflection. We'll see the limitations of that when we use the interactive demo. Post-processing. Heat distortion, and a heat distortion effect is used with particles. A distortion field is rendered to a texture using a 3D noise texture as an input. The field is then used to distort the input image into the post-processing phase. Bloom, here we are, we're back at the classic compute shader fast Fourier transform that evaluates several effects with one filter kernel. The effects are blur, streaks, and anamorphic flare, and lenticular halo. Bloom is computed in a reduced resolution to make it faster, and the bloom settings can be changed in the Explorer mode. So again, that's the similar technologies we've been seeing with the previous few benchmarks where they're using fast Fourier transform to compute the bloom effect. Volume illumination. Volume illumination is done in 3 passes and is used to lighten the scene fog. In the first pass, data on fog, volume, density, emission, and scattering is stored in a 3D froxel grid. What's that? So this is new to me. I was looking through this volumetric effects on the Last of Us Part 2 document, and a froxel is a view space frustum voxel grid. So essentially, I think what they are is voxels based within the viewing frustum. So if you look at this image here, you can see there's the camera viewpoint, clip plane, the viewing frustum, which is like this pyramid-y sort of shape that goes out from the camera. And I think what happens is the voxels are aligned with that, rather than just being squares, like here, or cubes. They're actually sort of aligned with the frustum, so you can get a much more accurate view of fog and volumetric effects. I've not heard that term before, and it is quite interesting. So again, links in the description to go into that more. So yeah, emission and scattering is stored in a 3D froxel grid, and the second pass light scattering for the data in each froxel is calculated. Volume illumination settings can be changed by the user in the Explorer mode, and Steel Nomad Light does not feature any volume illumination. So we've got depth of field, which uses a scatter as gather approach. Background and foreground are calculated in separate passes and combined in a final pass. Depth of field settings can be changed by the user in Explorer mode, and it uses XeGTAO for ambient occlusion, done in compute shaders. More you can read about this at its GitHub page. I've not heard of this one before either. XeGTAO. It looks like it's done by Intel, of all people. It's been archived. It's open source, MIT licensed DirectX HLSL implementation of the practical real-time strategies for accurate indirect occlusion. Wow, so you can see it's a much more advanced version of AO, or SSAO. I think XE stands for Intel's XE architecture, and GT is ground truth ambient occlusion, which is a little bit different from screen space. It's a little bit more advanced in how it calculates ambient occlusion versus screen space solutions. And yeah, you can see the differences here with settings. It looks like it takes the geometry into account rather than just the screen space depth data. So there's a lot of complicated stuff here. So I think what it does, it takes into account the depth and normal buffers and then does a scattering search to find out how those areas are blocked by the light coming towards it, and then implements a number of filters and some other complicated things to produce the ambient occlusion of objects. So on the left here, I think you have screen space occlusion, older style, with shadows unnaturally going to here and there, not looking quite accurate. Got the ray traced ground truth here, which looks a lot more accurate, and then there's their solution. So that's pretty awesome. It's another implementation. Again, incredibly complicated. Not even heard of that ground truth ambient occlusion. Interesting that it's optimized for Intel, but they're using it here on a generic thing that can be used for all graphics cards. It's also the fact that it's been discontinued as well, or archived on GitHub, but I guess that's probably the most advanced implementation of non-ray traced AO that there is at the moment, so that's why they put it in Steel Nomad. Again, all links in the description. I'm going to try and read up about that more myself, because that is incredibly complicated and interesting. And of course, finally, we're using TAA, temporal anti-aliasing. Motion vectors are computed in a fragment shader using G-buffer rendering. A lot of the G-buffer being used. Two history textures are used to store data from previous frames, depth and illumination, and exponential moving average with variance clipping is used to blend the data of the current frame. So essentially, previous TAAs would use data from previous frames to make anti-aliasing on the current frame, and there'd be a lot of blur. It looks like they've actually really made some advances in TAA and blended it a lot better by using motion vectors and blending the frames and taking into account depth and illumination, stuff like that. So they're actually storing more data from previous frames, and that's why modern implementations of TAA should look a lot better than older implementations. However, I imagine TAA is probably on the cusp of being deprecated due to new technologies such as XeSS and DLSS and AMD's FSR technologies. So I imagine TAA won't be around much longer, though I imagine on the consoles it probably still is being used, probably until the next version of consoles and the next version of mobile rendering starts using DLSS and FSR, XeSS, stuff like that. Or perhaps one day we'll reach a more unified, non-proprietary version of anti-aliasing and scaling, and then TAA will probably finally die. But for now, we've got quite a decent version of it, and here we have the version history, which is 1.0, the launch version. So it's all documented here. Again, this will be in the description. And here we have the technical details of Steel Nomad Lite, which is designed for low-end PCs. It looks like they've just copy and pasted the details here, saying about high-end gaming PCs. But this is indeed meant for lower-end PCs and for Windows and ARM, iOS, Android. So it uses DirectX 12, feature level 12, Vulkan 1.1, or Metal, or whatever OpenGLES rendering system Android uses. You've got the requirements here. So again, pretty much the same requirements as the normal version. iOS needs iOS 13, 8GB of RAM, GPU Apple Family 7 and 150 megabytes for the app and 1.7 gigabytes for the test of storage. Android requires at least Android 10, 8 gigabytes of RAM, Vulkan 1.1 compatible GPU. I'm guessing Android uses Vulkan now. And yep, just from a quick Google, it does indeed. So basically, yep, any newer Android phones from the 2020s and iOS from the 2020s should be able to run this. So we've got the graphics test, which is basically the same as the normal one. Again, more information about the scores been calculated here. And then we have a bit more information on the engine, which uses pretty much exactly the same stuff. The only thing it misses is volume illumination. That's pretty much the only thing missing from it. It uses depth of field, it uses XeGTAO, TAA, screen space reflections, screen space shadows, asynchronous compute. I think it just uses lower settings for all of these. And again, version history 1.0. Apparently this is deprecating TimeSpy for its DirectX 12 non-ray tracing benchmarks, but TimeSpy is still in the current benchmarks. I imagine at some point TimeSpy will be moved down into the unsupported test section. Again, eerily coincidental given I was just about to look at TimeSpy for this very video. So let's go into Steel Nomad, the main version. You can see here you got all the same details. There's no demo this time. It's kind of a mix because there is actually sound on the actual test itself. And there's an Explorer mode that also has sound on it that lets you move around the landscape and change settings on the fly. You've got your standard settings here between the display, the rendering device. You can select the resolution, DirectX 12 or Vulkan, VSync. There's HDR on this as well, which is really cool to see. So I've got that enabled disabled. We won't see it in the video because I can't record in HDR. And there's also a versus mode here where you can put in a URL of another run and do a comparison with it. So I have done a run on my laptop, and I'm going to try and put the link in there so we can see how that works in terms of a direct comparison. So we're going to run this in DirectX 12 and see what the results are, and then we're going to compare that with Vulkan and see how the performance differs. So let's jump in. So here we are. We can already see that it's very much Star Wars influenced. It's very, very Mandalorian sort of vibe. And there's a lot of cool references to other 3DMarks here, which features into my theory that the 3DMark universe is all interlinked. Oh, look at the shaders on those spheres. That looks so cool. Bit of Chappie style robots there. There's some ships from other 3DMarks in the background. Look at those particle effects. And you'll see a character from Firestrike. There we go. In fact, I think all the characters on here are from other 3DMarks. I mean, this looks fantastic for something that isn't ray traced. And so yeah, it seems like there's a bit of a sudden stop there at the end, but that is indeed the full run. So yeah, it's a really short test. But again, I imagine they're doing that because people want to run this over and over again to change overclocks and stuff like that. So they need a quick test just to go back and make sure it's running. They don't want a long test. But it still would be nice to see a demo. But then we do have the interactive mode, so kind of makes up for it. So here again, we have all the monitoring of the clock speeds, GPU load, clock frequencies, GPU load, GPU temperatures, CPU temperatures, frame rate. Again, you can put in all the data and see exactly what all the responses are. The average FPS there looks to be 82.58 FPS. And there we go, back to the detailed monitoring, which I always enjoy. You can see again the frame rate as it goes forward. Never dips below 70, it looks like. And again, we are running this, of course, on a 4090 with a Ryzen 7700X and 32 gigs of RAM. And you can see here the temperatures are about what you'd expect. Oh wow, the GPU load is at 100% the whole time, which means, yeah, that multi-threading is really making sure the GPU is fed that entire time with information. So that shows how efficient this is on the CPU side. That GPU is not once having to stop and wait for any information from the CPU. It is constantly being utilized and in a very efficient way. So this is really cool because we are entering the age of sort of ray tracing, and I guess neural rendering will be upcoming in the next few years, possibly into the next decade. But we are now seeing the ultimate utilization of rasterization and existing technologies and the optimizations of multiple CPU cores and all the technologies we've seen evolve over the past few years and over the past few weeks as we've been looking through all the 3DMarks and the new technologies they've introduced. You know, there was DirectX 10, which started to introduce sort of multi-threading, DirectX 11, which really hit into that, DirectX 12, which gets a bit more lower level and even more multi-threading, finding all those optimizations and how to utilize the CPU and GPU better in coordination with each other. So now let's do the same again, but using the Vulkan renderer. So here we are on Vulkan mode, which I imagine is going to look pretty much the same as DirectX 12 mode, but it would just have a bit of a performance difference. Such a satisfying benchmark. It's going to be really interesting to look around in the interactive mode. Yeah, this really is very Mandalorian influenced. The music, the overall sort of tone and style. Yep, just going through other 3DMark characters. I'm telling you, it's a 3DMark shared universe. And so the average FPS of the DirectX 12 one was 85.58, and this one is 88.88. So a little bit higher average FPS. The interesting thing is that the GPU load does indeed drop a little bit to 99% in some places, and I don't think it goes any lower than that. But it looks like 98.96% here. It looks like Vulkan's way of handling the CPU side may be a little less inefficient on this test than on the DirectX 12 side. So what they should include on here is the CPU load, which they don't quite include for some reason. Yeah, it looks like the CPU usage is probably not as optimal on Vulkan for this, but the overall graphics are higher. Could even be there's maybe less for the GPU to do do at certain points with Vulkan because it's more attuned to the NVIDIA hardware. Not sure. Okie dokie, so now we go to Steel Nomad Lite. Again, let's do a custom run. Make sure the resolution is at 4K. Do it in DirectX 12. Enable sound. Enable HDR. Let's dive in. Now this one's interesting because it's not just the same test but with lower settings. It's actually set at night. Now I imagine the reason why they've set it at night is so that it still looks good, but there's less volumetric effects and lighting to handle because there's no sunlight. There is moonlight though, but I imagine that's not so dependent on all the extra effects. So it's just interesting to see the same scene but at night. It still looks really, really good. So again, this is the same one you can get on mobile devices. So I've run it on my Android phone and it looks really good and runs really smoothly as well. There we go, 143.8 FPS. Let's have a look at the GPU utilization again. Yep, oh, 99 right at the beginning. It's probably just after it's loaded. Then 100% pretty much all the way through. Same as what we saw with DirectX 12 on the full version. So similar story there. Let's rerun that again on Vulkan. This again won't be a lot to see here. Just be very, very similar. The HDR really does look very good, even on this version with lower settings, just because the moonlight looks really, really nice. And the colours on those spheres look amazing as well. I love that water effect. So in the test you've just seen, I'd accidentally set the resolution to the default resolution, which is a lot lower than 4K. So the numbers you would have been seeing would have been much higher. I've now rerun that after seeing that mistake in editing, and it's running at 139.74 FPS, which is lower than it was in DX12. We can also see a similar thing of less GPU utilization here, stuck at 99% the whole way. It could be a way that the GPU load is measured in Vulkan, I'm not sure, but it's pretty consistent all the way through. Again, just a little dip at the beginning, possibly after it's loaded. So it's either there's less GPU load due to a CPU limitation or some sort of inefficiency with this test and Vulkan giving lower FPS. It's not too much of a difference. It was 143.8 in DX12 and it's 139.74, but still interesting to see the difference in the benchmark FPS there. I think it could just be how it's utilizing Vulkan or the version of Vulkan that is currently installed. I'm gonna have to try and look at some point other people's results to see if they show similar. So looking at Guru 3D's review of Steel Nomad, their 4090 is getting 93 FPS on the standard test with DirectX 12, and on Vulkan with the standard test they get 103. So they are getting higher FPS in the normal test, but they don't have a test on the light version. And just looking through the other people's results, it does appear that they are getting higher FPS in the Vulkan version of light as well. So this just could be an anomaly with this test I've done, but on the normal version, yeah, I was getting a higher frame rate with Vulkan. And I was also getting 99% GPU load on that as well, so I don't think the GPU load thing is a problem. I think that could just be a incorrect measurement when running in Vulkan, or just the way the GPU utilization is used in comparison to the CPU, but I don't think it affects the frame rate. Generally, Vulkan performs a little bit better. What I'm going to do now is put on versus mode and try and paste in a result from my laptop. Let's do this. Aha! So, you can actually see direct comparison between the two in an active real-time chart. Oh, that is really cool. So yeah, the existing line there is the laptop, and then the new lines being rendered above are this PC. Wow, so you can see the frame rate is much higher, GPU core clock is much higher, GPU temperature is similar. Bit of a jump at the beginning there. Yeah, the PC starts off cooler. You can just see the frame rate is just so much higher than the 3060 on the laptop. So yeah, that's really cool because you've always been able to compare results, obviously, but to do a real-time comparison like that with the other machine that you've run it on, and seeing the difference between the temperatures and the frame rate and stuff like that on a real-time sort of chart moving alongside. That's really cool to see. Give you some really good insights between different hardware. And so we have a valid result here on this one now. Now we've run the standard version, which is 8,452, and it looks like the absolute max with this same hardware is 10,028. I imagine that's someone overclocked. Doesn't look like Steel Nomad's on here yet, so there's no Hall of Fame for it yet. Okay, so now we're going to go to Steel Nomad again. We are going to go to Custom Explorer mode. We make sure we're running in 4K. We're going to run it in Vulkan, just so we're getting the very best performance out of it. Yeah, let's jump in and see what Explorer mode gives us. So here we are in the free roam mode. As you can see, it runs through the overall demo. And you can pause it. You can move around with W, A, S, and D keys. And you can click the right mouse button to move the camera, and the left mouse button will automatically set the focus of the camera. You can see real details here of everything, even things you don't really see in the actual demo as it runs. Things running in the background, cool hidden bits, and there's even some Easter eggs that we'll look into in a bit. But it enables you to get a really good close-up look at everything that's going on here. There's even some characters here just hanging out in the background doing things. And you don't even really see them in the actual demo, but there they are, just chilling out in the background. So again, really cool attention to detail there. You get a good look at all the water effects. And then what you do is you go down to this area here. And you can actually find there's some cool little references here. You've just got some random pads laying around, some cool stuff. Then you find there's the tree from 3DMark 2005 and 2006, which is really, really nice little reference. And you can actually find there's areas where you can just go through the geometry and find, again, more references to older 3DMarks. I believe that's the old sprite rendering test. I'm not quite sure what that's from. That's probably from 3DMark 11. And then you've got some of the old XLRAR from Mad Onion, boxes, 3DMark 99 and Shattered Horizon boxes. Really, really cool to see that. Amazing references. And there's the old Mad Onion symbol. There it is. That's so cool. But it gets cooler. I don't think I found everything in this yet, but I think I found the majority of the references. There's a reference up here, whereas if you scan through, you can see at the start of this, there's the 3DMark 99 demo. There it is. That's so cool. And then they flick over to a news report, which shows the moon has blown up. There's Earth, there's the moon, and there it is blown up, which is the disaster that kicks off the events of Shattered Horizon, which makes sense because in the sky, you can see ships from the 3DMark Vantage space test, and you can also see ships from the Ice Storm test, which also have very similar looks to them as the ships in Shattered Horizon. So I think all of this just shows that there is indeed a 3DMark shared universe, and we're just seeing different areas and different times within that universe during all these benchmarks. Mushroom-based biofuels. There's so much detail to this. As we go through here, we can see the cool looking skin on this dude. Really nicely detailed. Really well done. And down here you got funny robot drinks such as Botweiser Biodiesel series and Lubritron Racing High Viscosity Motor Oil. And then there's the helmet from one of the newer tests, I believe Speed Racer. And then as we go up here, there is a whole load of really cool drawings, presumably by either artists working on 3DMark or maybe some of the devs' children that have been inspired by 3DMark. Really nice stuff. Really cool to see. Because yeah, it looks like there's a drawing of inspired by Vantage there. And that looks like possibly Firestrike. Inspired by that. And then probably Shattered Horizon inspired picture here. So hopefully 3DMark has been inspiring people. Nice little Easter eggs. And we go further into more Easter eggs here with a random little game that I don't recognise, but maybe something related to FutureMark or something the devs have worked on. You've got the captain from the hover ship in 3DMark 2005, or 2003, 2005, and 2006. Again, another XLRAR from Mad Onion there, their previous test before 3DMark 99. There's the ship from Port Royale, There's the little racers from 3D Mark 99. There's some random trading cards. There's the car from 3D Mark 2001, which we only looked at a few weeks ago. There's a guard from 3D Mark Vantage. And there he is. It's the Max Payne dude from 3D Mark 2001, who's looking a little bit more shiny with some newer shaders on him than there were in 3D Mark 2001. There's the crawler from the ice test in 3D Mark 2006. And there's a soldier from Return to Procyon from 2003 and 2005, as well as a plane from 2003 as well. And then some blocks here, which looks like they may be referencing the castle scene from 2000. So yeah, this is perfect. This is perfect. This is such a good little reference back to older versions of 3D Mark, back to Mad Onion, because I had no idea this new benchmark was coming out, because it kind of reflects my own nostalgia that I've been going through the past couple of months as I've been going through all the 3D Marks, so it's perfect timing. I do wonder if oh, there's another Mad Onion symbol. That's really cool. And in here, 3D Mark, Future Mark symbol. I do wonder if some of the devs had maybe seen, I'd like to think they'd maybe seen my video on 3D Mark 2000, which got quite a lot of views, and it inspired them, I don't know, maybe to make this or put a few references in it. I doubt it, but it would be really cool if that was the case. And if there are any devs watching from 3D Mark or ul.com, happy to have you watching, and thanks for all the work you've done. Again, I doubt any of them ever are going to see this, but if they ever did, that would be really cool. What we're going to do now is get a view down here, and let's go through all the settings. So volumetric sky, switch that off, basically a black sky. Grass off, still maintains some grass, but most of it's gone. Decals, that's extra details on the textures there, you can see disappearing. Translucency, switch that off. Shadow maps, volume illumination, particles, ambient occlusion, screen space shadows, screen space reflections, TAA, indirect illumination, bloom, and depth of field all off. So now what happens is that this starts to look like 3D Mark 2003 to 2005 sort of era again, with all these settings off. Because yeah, it's just really old school. It's just down to the bare basics. It looks like it's still normal maps and stuff like that, and basic shading and lighting. But yeah, it really shows how much these effects can make a difference. And then if we switch it all back on, there we go. We can see we're back up to 2024 levels, which is really interesting because yeah, you can see the volumetric sky makes a big difference, how the grass makes a difference, how the decals make a difference. And the shadow maps obviously make a huge difference, and you can see how volume illumination really makes a difference there with lighting up volumetric space, how that makes a difference. Particles makes a huge difference as well, really even changes the lighting and works really well with the volume illumination. There's the extra particles in the atmosphere there, adding that extra lighting in. Screen space shadows. This is a really interesting one because I've always wondered about screen space shadows, and you can see here how inaccurate they actually are. So if you find some grass around here, you can kind of see, if we turn the particles off so you can see a bit clearer, you can kind of see how the shadows aren't that accurate. Like they'll move dependent on where the camera is. The shadows will move, which obviously isn't how shadows work. So you can see here, if you turn them off, you can see exactly what they're doing. They are adding in decent shadowing, but you can kind of see a little bit there as you zoom in and out, the shadow's changing almost. I think that's probably as the camera sort of frustum changes. Especially these shadows here, there we go, that's a good example. These shadows here will change and seemingly elongate as you zoom out, because I think the way it's getting the depth information from screen space isn't making for the most accurate shadows. So as the camera moves, the shadows will actually change on these. So screen space shadows, they do the job. They make the grass look a lot more realistic by adding shadows onto them and giving them a lot more depth. But when you look closely, you see they are quite inaccurate. Another thing that's really cool to see is if we go up to an area up here, you can see this little section here. And if we turn off the ambient occlusion, you can just see the amount of heavy lifting that XeGTAO is doing to the scene. An absolute insane amount of heavy lifting to the look of the image, and how far AO has come, because that is just insane. The difference that makes to the overall image. And what I've also found is that ambient occlusion and indirect illumination complement each other a great deal. So if we go down here and have a look at the scene here, if you turn off indirect illumination, obviously a lot of these areas go into complete darkness because there's no GI to sort of bounce the lighting you're just getting direct lighting. If you turn off ambient occlusion as well, and then you turn on indirect illumination without GI, you end up with some excessive brightness, which is kind of the look you had in the earlier days of GI implementations, where everything kind of had an excessive glow to it because there was too much indirect illumination, too much lighting bouncing around. And then when you turn on the ambient occlusion, it takes a lot of that under control and occludes the lighting where it should be, and you reduce that glow and that artificial look. So those two things, they complement each other really, really well, because obviously you need the indirect illumination, but without the ambient occlusion to control occluding that lighting, you end up with too much glow. So with the ambient occlusion on, you've still got that indirect lighting, but it's much more under control and reflected by their geometry using the new GTAO. So modern day GI and modern day AO implementations, even on rasterization, look really, really good together. And that's why you get these really clean looking scenes now with realistic looking lighting. It's come a long way, but you do have to wonder how much more is left with rasterization before it just becomes more efficient to just purely use ray tracing. And I imagine we're on the cusp. But it's really interesting to see all these implementations, because not only is it going over the sort of retro feeling of previous benchmarks, it's also going over all the technologies of previous benchmarks that we've been looking at over the past few weeks. And you're seeing these all come to an almost culmination of rasterization technology. You know, the ambient occlusion, the shadows technologies, the volumetrics, bloom technologies, stuff like that. It's all come to a bit of a head, and I think this is probably one of the most advanced sort of rasterization implementations we will see. Like I said, I just don't know how much more there is left to do with rasterization. You can see the volume illumination there is having a little bit of an effect in the smoke particles there, which isn't related to the timing of the scene. Turning off screen space reflections just completely turns off the water for some reason, which is strange. You'd think they'd keep the water on, but just use the cube map fallbacks, because you can see if you take it off screen, obviously like any screen space reflections, the reflections disappear because it can't reflect what's off screen because it's screen space. But it does have cube map fallbacks, so you can see the cube map there as a fallback. So you'd think just turning off screen space reflections would keep the water, but just put the cube maps in, but it doesn't. It completely gets rid of the water. Maybe that's something they'll fix in a future release of this, because that would make more sense than to just completely remove it. And you've got some translucency here, so you've got light coming through here, shadowing through there, through this cloth here. If you turn off the translucency, that is completely gone. So again, another cool technology. I wonder if there's any translucency on this dude here. No, there isn't. Yeah, you got the cube map fallbacks there. It's interesting, even though everything's pretty much off screen, the clouds are off screen there, screen space reflections being on still makes them look a little bit sharper. So yeah, you can just keep looping through this and exploring. You can also adjust the focal length, various bloom settings like streak, lenticular halo, anamorphic flare, all that good stuff. So you can make a really ridiculous looking scene. So you can really make it look crazy as you like, and then obviously save screenshots with it. You can add tone mapping in, we can change all the exposure, really go crazy with it, which makes it go ludicrously bright in HDR. Wow. And then of course there's the different settings here, and you can do more fine-tuned movements by holding down control. You can do more speedier movements by holding down shift, and then you can reset all the settings here. In fact, that slow camera mode here, you can actually see a lot more of an example of those screen space shadows. You can see the shadow there of that grass moving along as the camera moves, which is obviously not right. Shadows wouldn't do that. And there also looks like a bit of parallax occlusion mapping there with a bit of a weird warping thing. So again, another limitation of that. So you can imagine, you know, that would be cleaned up with ray tracing. This would be cleaned up with something like nanite or something like that. So you can still see the limitations of rasterization here. And again, you've got that volume illumination creating a nice little effect there. Although when you're in motion, you don't really notice it as much. And it's also compatible with the controller as well. So that is the free roam on Steel Nomad, the main version. Let's check out the free roam on Steel Nomad Lite. And here we are on the light version, which of course is set at night. And you see a lot more limitations here. I think there's less accurate screen space reflections. There's no volumetric lighting. There is a volumetric sky. There's the decals, shadow maps, particles, screen space shadows, translucency, grass, ambient occlusion, screen space reflections, and there is indirect illumination. So there's still quite a lot of the effects that are on the main version. And of course, the whole scene looks a little bit different because it's at night. The textures are still pretty high res. Oh, you can definitely see that blur there with the volumetric sky. Could be reduced update rates, reduced accuracy. Still looks great, but you can definitely tell, like I say, you can definitely tell that it's a reduced. Yeah, look at the flickering there. Wow. Yeah, definitely tell it's reduced accuracy and stuff like that. Which again makes sense because it's meant for lower end PCs, and it's also the shared benchmark with the mobile version. This is pretty much what will run on a phone. But it still looks really good. Like I said, I like that they've made it at night time as well, so it gives a bit of a visual distinction. There's another ship up there as well. Looks like another Shattered Horizon style ship flying over. Just gives it a very distinct, different style having it in the moonlight. And yeah, all the Easter eggs are the same here as well. So no change to the Easter eggs. That is exceedingly cool. And yeah, we can basically do the same thing we did with the previous one, which is turn all the settings off and basically make it look like a way older 3D Mark. And then of course what we can then do is flick all the settings back on. So again, you can still play around with the bloom settings, lenticular halos, the anamorphic flares. There's just a lot less of them because there's not so much light from the sun coming. Obviously it's all moonlight. Fantastic looking benchmark. So yeah, I'm really happy with that. Really happy. Like I said, it's so cool that they've decided to do a new benchmark as I'm doing my videos through 3D Mark, and it's so cool that they've done a whole bunch of references to previous 3D Marks. Makes me very happy. This is just so cool, seeing all the previous 3D Mark stuff. I could probably do a few more references towards 2000. I may have missed some. It seems there's 99, 2001, 2003, stuff like that. But not too many references to 2000 for some reason. Like I said, maybe this sphere is a reference to the sphere from 2000. And maybe I've just missed some stuff. So let me know in the comments if I have missed any Easter eggs with this. So that pretty much wraps up this video. We've looked at the new benchmark. We've looked at the exploration mode. We looked at the performance between Vulkan and DirectX 12. We looked at some of the new features, the graphical features of the engine. And generally, like I said, we've seen a culmination of all the years of rasterization technologies all coming up to this point. I wonder if this will be the last benchmark they do that is indeed rasterized, because we are heading into the sort of era of ray tracing and possibly even neural rendering. There it is, Steel Nomad, the new benchmark just released this week. Leave a comment, let me know what you think. Some people have said that it's a little bit too short in some of the reviews and stuff like that, and yeah, I think it's just the actual main benchmark is quite short to enable people to get a quick benchmark of their system, and you can run a stress test with it to loop it for overclocking and stuff like that, and that the exploration mode does add a lot of extra mileage to the experience, because you can just spend as long as you want in that exploration mode turning on and off settings. And it's really cool that they've added in a reshade style settings menu there. Hopefully they keep doing that as we go forward. So next week we will be looking at Time Spy, Night Raid, and also the CPU profiling test. So stick around for that. Leave a like, subscribe, hit the little bell. There's always new videos coming up on tech and video games. Hope everyone's staying safe, and I will see you in the next video.